All right, welcome back. It looked like we did have a couple of radon questions, but we have lost Rick for this segment. So when he comes back in the next segment, if there are radon questions, we will address them then. Right now, we're going to be talking about Coastal Barrier Resources Act. And this is a very short one. Actually, there are several short ones in a row that I'll be going through. And the first one is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Compliance is required by our regulations at 24 CFR, Part 50.4 C1, and is also discussed in the map guide at Chapter 9.5J. Okay, this is an overview of the CBRA, Coastal Barrier Resources Act. The purpose is to discourage federal expenditures that encourage development in hurricane-prone, biologically rich coastal barrier areas. What was happening is the federal government was subsidizing and encouraging development in coastal barrier areas. And so in order to discourage the federal incentive, there were undeveloped areas, relatively undeveloped areas, that were designated as coastal barrier resource systems. And they are mapped and described as coastal barrier resource system units. And this is very, very simple. HUD is prohibited from any projects in the Coastal Barrier Resource System unit. So if you have a project that is located in a CBRS unit, that includes also water mains or other infrastructure that will cross a CBRS unit or leading to a CBRS unit, it must be rejected. And this applies to all FHA projects. Okay, this is just a little diagram of the process. Like I said, it's very simple. So the first thing that you're going to ask is whether or not you're in a state that contains a CBRS unit. If yes, then you're going to move forward. If no, your project is in compliance. So if yes, you are located in a state that contains a CBRS unit, then you're going to look to find out whether or not you're actually located in a CBRS unit. If no, your project is in compliance. And if you are, then you must reject the project. Very simple. Okay, so here is a list of states that contain CBRS units. If your project is located in one of these states, then you're going to go on to the mapper. If your project is not located in one of these states, you are done. You don't have to go any further. You are in compliance with the CBRA. Okay, so if your project is in one of those states that I just showed, then you're going to go to the Fish and Wildlife Services Coastal Barrier Resource Act mapper. And this is that project site. Remember that this information should be provided by the lender in the environmental report. This is not something that you would necessarily have to do, but I'm providing you with this information so that you know what to look for in the environmental report. Okay, this is examples of the CBRS map up at the top left-hand corner. You can see the project location is actually inside the CBRS unit. Also, FEMA maps, the ones that we talked about yesterday, will also show you whether or not the project is located in a CBRS unit. And then you can see also for New Jersey, some states have specific maps showing the CBRS units for that state. These are all examples of projects within a CBRS unit and must be rejected. Okay, so for your final documentation, like I said, it was pretty simple. For the final documentation, a statement that your project is not in a state with a CBRS unit. If it is, then use that CBRA mapper or the Fish and Wildlife Service FEMA map to show that your project is not in a CBRS unit. If it is in a CBRS unit, remember you are rejecting it. Information on our HUD exchange can be found at this website below. I hope that you can see it on Coastal Barrier Resource Systems. Okay, so that is it for the CBRA. I told you it was pretty simple. The next few ones are kind of like that. The next one we're going to go over is Coastal Zone Management Act. Okay, the Coastal Zone Management Act. And the requirement, we are required to comply with this act per our regulations at 24 CFR Part 50.4 C2 and is also discussed in the map guide at Chapter 9.5K. Okay, and the purpose, as also stated here, is to preserve, protect, and restore and enhance the resources of our nation's coast. Each coastal state has developed a management plan to manage their activities along their coast. If a HUD project will be constructed in a state's coastal zone, it must be consistent with that state coastal zone management plan. And so this one also is pretty simple, as we had discussed for the CBRA. Whether or not you're in a designated coastal zone is what you're looking for. You're either in or out of the coastal zone. If you're in the coastal zone, you want to make sure that your project is consistent with the coastal zone management plan. The potential triggers are any FHA projects except for the 223A7s. Okay, the process is pretty simple, as stated here. Determine whether or not your project is in a state with a coastal zone. If you're not in a state with a coastal zone, the project is in compliance. Determine if your project is within a state with a coastal zone, then you're going to actually go a little further and look to see if your project is actually in the designated coastal zone. If it's outside of the coastal zone, make sure you include that project location on the map, and you are done with compliance. If the project is in the coastal zone, there must be a determination that is consistent with the Coastal Zone Management Agency's program. Ask for technical support for projects that are located in a coastal zone. This is the flow chart of what we just said, whether, kind of help you out, see it in a different way. But really what you're looking for is whether or not your project is in a coastal zone. If it is, then it's got to be consistent with the State Coastal Zone Management Agency's management plan. Here are the list of the states containing coastal zones. If your project is not in one of these, you are done. If it is, then you're going to move just a little bit further to find out if you are in that state's coastal zone. Also, the coastal zones are a little bit different from the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Coastal Barrier Resources Act, there's one map for the entire coastal barrier resources. For coastal zones, each individual state maps their coastal zones. And so when you actually go to the state's coastal zone website, all the maps are going to be different. And so this is just an example here of the differences of each state's map. But each state that's in a coastal zone, has a coastal zone, should have their areas mapped. And so you'll need to go to that particular state's coastal zone website and find out whether or not your project is in a coastal zone. Okay, if your project is located in a coastal zone, then you're going to contact that state coastal zone management agency to find out if your project is consistent with the program. Please note, as also stated here, that there's not a 30-day time limit for the states to respond. They can take up to 90 days. So make sure that you get that you have the lenders get that information to you early, so that if you are in a coastal zone, that consistency notification can be gotten and not cause any delays. Okay, final documentation, as I've said several times now through this process. So the general location map establishing whether or not the project is in a state with a coastal zone. If you are in a state with a coastal zone, that map showing that you are outside of that designated coastal zone. And then if you are within the coastal zone, you want to have that documentation from the Coastal Zone Management Agency saying that it's consistent with their program. Here is again our HUD Exchange website where you can go to for more information on the Coastal Zone Management Act. And we're just going to keep zipping on through here. We're going to stop and have some questions at the end of this segment, but these are really, really short, and so we're just going to keep going through these real short ones. And if there's questions, we'll stop at the end and make sure that we answer those for you. The next one is Sole Source Aquifers. The next presentation, like I said, is Sole Source Aquifers, and what we're trying to do is comply with the State Drinking Water Act of 1974. HUD's requirements, HUD requires us to comply with this act at 24 CFR 50.4D, and it is also discussed in the map guide at Chapter 9.5L. Just an overview of the Sole Source Aquifers requirements. The EPA regulates projects that may impact environmentally sensitive aquifers called sole source aquifers. Sole source aquifers mean that it is the sole or primary drinking water source for a community. Therefore, it must be protected from contamination and conserved to prevent depletion. The potential triggers are any new construction projects, demolition projects, and substantial rehabilitation projects in a sole source aquifer. Okay, the EPA regulates the sole source aquifers, and they have maps that you will need to go to. You'll go to the EPA's sole source aquifer website, Each state has its own maps, and you'll be able to see whether or not your project is located in a sole source aquifer. Here's some examples of maps in the areas with the colored areas showing the sole source aquifers for those states. Okay, the process is pretty simple. So first you're going to find out if your project includes any new construction, demolition, or substantial rehabilitation. If not, the project is in compliance. If it is, and you are over a sole source aquifer, then you're going to want to seek technical support. Sometimes there's a memorandum of understanding or other agreement with the EPA that excludes specific projects from further review. If you have one of those, then your project is in compliance. If not, you're going to need to work with the EPA to determine if your project will contaminate or impact that sole source aquifer. So the final documentation that we're looking for in the environmental report, and again, all this information should be provided to you by the lender in the environmental report. We're going to be looking for that sole source aquifer map from the EPA showing that your project is outside of the sole source aquifer. And if it is within the sole source aquifer, whether or not there's a memorandum of understanding that excludes the project. If there isn't, then documentation that you've consulted with the EPA to make sure that there's no impacts to the sole source aquifer drinking water. Again, here's our website on the HUD Exchange website on sole source aquifers, where you can find some more information. And we're just speeding on through. Okay, the next one is a little bit more in depth. It is the airport hazards we're going to be talking about. HUD has environmental standards at 24 CFR Part 51 Subpart D that specifically states about locating projects in near airports. And that's what we're going to be discussing now. The requirements, we're required to comply with this regulation at 24 CFR Part 50.4K, and this is also discussed in the MAP guide at Chapter 9.5M. Okay, just an overview of the airport hazards. It is HUD's policy to not provide any assistance, subsidy, or insurance for projects located in an airport runway clear zone, which is 2,500 feet off the end of a runway of a civilian airport. Also, 15,000 feet off the end of a military airport is the military airfield clear zone and accident potential zones. Now, the purpose is to promote compatible development around civil airports and military airfields. But what we're really trying to prevent is what is shown in this picture right here, and we do not want airplanes crashing into our projects. So that is really what we're trying to prevent here. Potential triggers are any FHA project except for 223A7, because those should have already gone through the environmental review process. This is a flow chart, again, to try to help you understand the process. I kind of put in the 3 miles because sometimes when you're really far away from an airport, you don't really have to go into whether or not you're 15,000 or 2,500 feet away from an airport. So the first thing we're going to look at is really whether or not you're within 3 miles of a military airfield or civilian airport. If you're not, then your project is in compliance. If yes, you're going to just see how close you are. If you're within 15,000 feet of a military airfield, you're going to go further. If you're not, then you're in compliance and you don't have to go any further. If your project, then the next question is your project within 2,500 feet of a civilian airport? If you're further than 2,500 feet from a civilian airport, your project is in compliance. If you are within 2,500 feet, then you're going to have to do some more work. Anytime that you are within those threshold distances, you should seek technical support for assistance with compliance. Okay. This next graph that I'm going to show you kind of really outlines the, we're going to talk about military airfields. This is for military airfields. This is a diagram of the 15,000 feet off the end of a runway for a military airfield. And what shows in this diagram, the first 3,000 feet is what we consider the clear zone for the military airfield. This has the highest percentage of accidents. No HUD project is allowed within the clear zone of a military airfield. The next 5,000 feet is what we call the accident potential zone 1, and then the next 7,000 feet are the accident potential zone 2. There are still incidences of accidents occurring in these areas, but they are a lot less than the clear zone. And HUD projects are very limited in the APZ 1 and 2, so you definitely want to check with your technical assistants if you find that your project is within those threshold distances. I added this diagram just to kind of show you the difference between the civilian airport clear zone and the military airfield clear zone. You can see the civilian airport runway clear zone in blue, and it is 2,500 feet. No project is allowed in the clear zone, and there is no distances after that clear zone that you have to be worried about, as there is with the military airfield. Okay, we're going to talk specifically about civilian airports. What we're talking about here are existing commercial service airports, and these are designated and listed in the Federal Airport Administration's National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or NPIAS. You can use this website to find out how many airports and what airports are actually near your project site. It is address driven. And notice the airplane in the housing there below that. I just wanted to point that one out. That is what we are trying to prevent. Okay, here's an example of a map that you may see in the environmental report. Remember, all this information should be provided in the environmental report from the lender. I can see it's kind of hard to tell the distance on this one, but what it shows is 2,500 and I believe it's 4 feet, 2,504 feet. That really is too close to call, especially using Google Earth for the distances. So if you were to get this in your environmental report, you definitely want to get more information to find out whether or not that project is actually located in the civilian airport's runway clear zone. And if your project is within that runway clear zone, just like that, or really too close to call, then the next step is to contact the airport operator to find out whether or not your project is located in that clear zone. And that is the final say-so for this project. You also want to ask them if there's any plans to expand the area, because maybe your project would be located in the clear zone in the future. So you're going to ask them, provide them with the information about your project, find out if it is in the clear zone, or also if there's plans for expansion, will it be in the clear zone in the future? If it's not, then your project is in compliance and you're good to go. If it is within the clear zone or will be in the clear zone in the future, it must be rejected. No HUD projects can be built in the runway clear zone. Okay. For military airfields, like we had talked about before in the graph, we're dealing with the clear zones, which has the high potential for accidents, and then the accident potential zone 1 and the accident potential zone 2. Okay, when you're evaluating military airfield, the threshold distance is 15,000 feet. This is a website that you can go to for getting information on military airfields near your project site. If you're not within 15,000 feet, your project is in compliance. If you are within 15,000 feet, you're going to need that information from the airport operator to find out whether or not your project is located in the clear zone for that airport or the APZ 1 or 2. Remember that projects within the clear zone of a military airfield are not allowed and are very limited in the APZ 1 or APZ 2. All this information should be provided in the environmental report from the lender. Okay, and I think I just said this, but just one more time, if it's in the clear zone for the military airfield, it is going to be rejected. If it is in the APZ 1 or 2, then there's a specific guideline that determines the land use compatibility for the airport accident potential zones 1 and 2, and it is here. Seek technical assistance for help on determining whether or not your project can move forward if it's in the APZ 1 or 2. This is another example of a map that you may actually get in the environmental report. This one says, I believe it says 15,008 feet. That really is too close to call. You're going to want to talk to the airport operator and find out whether or not this project is located in the APZ 1 or 2. Documentation, I think I've said this several times, but you can't say it enough. So we're looking for the threshold distances for the airport, whether it's a military airport or a civilian airport, whether or not you're in those threshold distances. You're going to need evidence that the site is not within the RPZ or the APZ, or a letter from the operator. And if you are within the APZ for a military airfield, then you're going to make sure that that project is compatible using that DoD land use compatibility guidelines. Okay, we have now accomplished several all in a row, and we're moving right on through. So if you have questions for anything that I have talked about so far, please go ahead and email those in. We will make sure and take time to answer questions in just a few minutes. Okay, the next one we're going to be talking about is Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Compliance with Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is required by 24 CFR Part 50.4F and is discussed in the map guide at Chapter 9.50. Okay, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968 established the National Wild and Scenic River Systems, or NWSRS. Rivers and river segments are classified as wild, scenic, or recreational, and only uses that are compatible with management goals are allowed on these designated rivers. The purpose of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is to preserve the character and protect the river's outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values in a free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. All new construction projects, including 221D4 projects, are subject to compliance with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Why is it important? That's a good question. Rivers are very important. They also are our main source of drinking water. A healthy river makes for a clean water supply. Wild rivers can provide flood protection. They support recreation and tourism activities, and they also support a diverse habitat for fish and wildlife. Only a fraction of 1% of America's rivers flow freely. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act helps make sure that rivers and their ecosystems stay healthy for generations to come. Okay, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is a pretty simple process also. These ones that we've been going through, you can see that they're pretty simple. So the first step is to determine if your project is within proximity to an NWSRS river. If the project is not near a protected river, then you're in compliance. If you are near a protected river, you may want to seek some technical support to find out if your project could have an impact on the outstanding remarkable values of the river. And the third step is to consult with the river administering agency if you may have impacts. Each of these rivers, the states have different agencies that can be regulating the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, so check with your state to find out what agency may be the one that you need to contact. Okay, so there are several different designations that are protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. The first is the big one, that's the designated Wild and Scenic River. This is the one that everybody thinks about, and it's the easiest one to map. And we get a lot of these that say, I'm 300 miles away from the nearest Wild and Scenic River, but there are other rivers that are protected under the Act. The Study River are the ones that have the potential to be added to the Wild and Scenic River systems, and they are protected under the Act. And the one that is most often forgotten are the Nationwide Rivers Inventory List. These rivers are included on the list because they are believed to possess one or more of the outstanding, remarkable natural cultural values with more than local or regional significance, and they are protected under Section 5D of the Act. These rivers are also protected, so don't forget to look up whether or not your project is near a river on the Nationwide Rivers Inventory List. This is some information that you may receive in the environmental report. I'll just make one statement. All of this information that should be provided in the environmental report from the lender. The map on the right shows the actual designated Wild and Scenic River in the state of Arizona, but the one down at the bottom are actually river and river segments that are listed on the national on the NRI list that are still protected under the Act. So make sure that you don't forget about the NRI list river segments. Okay, If your project is within proximity of a protected river, then you're going to want to get with technical support to find out if you're going to have any impacts. Most likely, HUD projects are not going to be located near a wild and scenic river or a protected river, and if they are, most likely HUD projects are not going to impact the free-flowing form of the river. That's really what we're looking for. However, seek technical assistance if you are close to a protected river, just to make sure that we have complied with all the requirements. If you are going to have impacts, you're going to want to consult with the river administrating agency that we discussed earlier. And like I said, there are several different agencies, depending on the state, that covers that responsibility. Final documentation, what we're really looking for is, the proximity map showing where your project is located from the nearest protected river. Again, we're going to add in here, please don't forget about the NRI river segments. And if you are going to have a potential impact, make sure that you have correspondence in your environmental report that you've discussed this project with the RAA. The HUD Exchange website is listed below, where you can find more information on wild and scenic rivers. Okay, where are we on the, I've been going so fast I don't even know where we are. Okay. We're up to Liz. Okay, I can take a break. Okay, so I'm gonna pass this over to Liz, and if there are questions, please keep them coming, and we will answer questions at the end of the segment.
Yeah, it looks like we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, so we might be able to take a few questions, and if not, maybe get a couple extra minutes for lunch.
Sounds good.
All right, so now we're moving on to the Clean Air Act, which is part 50.4H and in chapter 9.5.0. So the Clean Air Act is a federal law, but it's implemented by the states. So your compliance requirements are going to vary quite a bit by location. And it's kind of difficult to tell you as a national audience how to comply. It's also pretty rare that a HUD project will actually trigger any required mitigation or compliance with the Clean Air Act, just because of the scope of our projects. So when we consider the Clean Air Act compliance, we're looking at the pollutants emitted by your project. So generally, our projects at HUD are small enough in scale that they don't really raise any red flags. What we're really going to be concerned about this one is really large new construction projects, like maybe hospitals or very, very large multifamily housing projects. So when the Clean Air Act is an issue, it's going to be really technical, really complicated, and location specific. So it's one where it's going to be really important to work with your local technical support and field and regional environmental officers. Obviously, air quality has a huge impact on the community. Living in an area with bad air quality raises risks of all manner of health impacts, including stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, asthma, and other respiratory diseases. So from HUD's perspective, we're primarily going to be concerned about the impacts of low air quality on our projects and on our residents. But there are also cases where we should ask whether the project itself could impact the air quality for the broader community. There's a lot of complicated terminology in the Clean Air Act, so we'll go through that really quickly. There are 6 criteria pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act. These are ground level ozone or smog, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, lead, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, all things that you really don't want to be breathing in. So for each of these 6, the EPA sets National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, which are limits on the acceptable concentration level for each pollutant. So areas that exceed these National Ambient Air Quality Standards are called non-attainment areas, and former non-attainment areas that have since achieved National Ambient Air Quality Standards are referred to as maintenance areas. And we continue to look out for and protect maintenance areas to ensure that they maintain that attainment status. Finally, each state develops a state implementation plan, or a SIP, which outlines how it intends to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So this is the document that will actually tell you how to bring your project into compliance with the Clean Air Act. So if you are looking at a large new construction or conversion project, you'll need to ask whether the site is in a non-attainment or maintenance location. The environmental report, again, should provide this information for you. But mostly this information will come from the Environmental Protection Agency's website, the EPA's website. So here's an example of something you might pull or see from the EPA's website. NEPA Assist is another good website that provides data on some pollutants, although not others. So you might see data from there as well. This particular chart, it lists all the counties in Arizona and which pollutants, if any, are in non-attainment status for that county. I don't know why we have a lot of Arizona examples in the last couple PowerPoints. And I see that my hair was on my microphone, so hopefully that helped. I'm glad I was on camera for that moment. If the area is in non-attainment for all criteria pollutants, you're automatically in compliance with the Clean Air Act. However, as this map shows, that's often not going to be the case. A lot of areas are in non-attainment or maintenance status. So for any project that's in the white space for this map, they're in compliance with the Clean Air Act. But as you can see, most major urban areas and a lot of areas that are not urban at all are in non-attainment or maintenance status for at least one pollutant. So if your project is in a non-attainment area, you're going to look at state requirements to bring your project into compliance. So at this point, we'd recommend going to technical support. You're going to need somebody with some local expertise and experience to guide you through how to comply with the state implementation plan. So you'll need to either demonstrate that your project's emissions will be below de minimis levels, or you'll have to mitigate to bring the project into compliance. If you can't get emissions within acceptable levels, that would be grounds to reject the project. But again, it's relatively unlikely that any HUD project would be on that scale. But bringing it either to within de minimis levels or mitigating to bring it into compliance are going to be necessary. And wrapping this one up, these are your options for documenting compliance with the Clean Air Act. If your project is a straight refinance or just a rehab, then a simple determination that this isn't the type of project that could contribute to non-attainment is going to be sufficient. If it is new construction or a conversion, but the project is in an attainment area, you'll just need documentation that the county or locality is in attainment for all criteria pollutants. And finally, if it's new construction or conversion that is also in a non-attainment or maintenance area, then you'll want to work with technical support to document that the project's emissions will not exceed de minimis levels or can be mitigated to be brought into compliance. And that's it for Clean Air Act, and I think all the topics we need to cover in this section. So we'll see if we have any questions.
All right, we'll take a couple of seconds. No questions. We're on a lunch break. Reminder to send your questions in to daniel.j.sullivan@hud.gov. And it is now what time? It is 11:33, and so we'll take until 12:45. Go ahead and do the 12:45. We'll see you back at 12:45.
Thanks.